My dear students, we think of the children of Israel in Egypt as the oppressed and of Pharaoh as the oppressor. But while Pharaoh issued commands from his palace throne, he was as much a slave as were his Jewish subjects. Now, how can we say that Pharaoh was a slave when he reigned as the most powerful man on earth, when all peoples bowed down to him in submission, when his freedom of action seemed unrestricted by circumstance or convention? Pharaoh wore no chains and was not the victim of the overseer's lash, but Pharaoh was in thrall to his baser instincts, to his tendency toward self-destruction, and to his inability to subdue his passions. 10 times Pharaoh might have stopped the downward course on which he was headed. 10 times he could have seen the situation as it was and not as he wanted it to be. Instead, he continually hardened his heart to the point that he was no longer free to do what was in his own best self-interest. So for all the pomp and power of his office, Pharaoh was enslaved to inner forces that he at first refused to overcome and then at last was unable to overcome. As the poet James Oppenheim wrote, "They set the slave free, striking off his chains. Then he was as much of a slave as ever. He was still chained to servility. He was still manacled to indolence and sloth. He was still bound by fear and superstition, by ignorance and savagery and suspicion. His slavery was not in the chains, but in himself." Pharaoh's chains too were of his own making. He was responsible for his own hard-heartedness. He prevented himself from seeing that the assaults upon his kingdom would end in his ruin. Now, there are times when we too stubbornly refuse to see what is in our best interest, and when we make choices that lead down a bad road. But we rationalize and justify our behavior until it becomes too late to avert the consequences. We work against reality in the fantasy of our own omnipotence. We imagine ourselves to be in control and that things will work out to our advantage despite what we do. We then are enslaved to irrational beliefs that we will not suffer penalties for our behavior. When we think that by stubbornly insisting on our own ways of thinking and acting, even when the results look threatening to our very well-being and self-interest, we should remember Pharaoh, who was enslaved to his own self-destructive behavior and who was complicit in his own downfall. And then we should remember the Jewish teaching, Ezehu Chacham, who is wise? He who can foresee the results of his behavior. Shabbat Shalom.